Alright YouTube, I promised to make another video about the occult on the topic of sex magic, and I've got my phallic symbol right here. Just joking around with everyone. Yeah, I like to have a little bit of fun. See my hand-knitted socks? Yeah, quite colorful. But anyway, to the topic of sex magic. I think we need to differentiate a little bit between personal experience and theory. I have never performed any form of sex magic. Of that you can be assured, because I've never dragged ritualism and, that sort of thing together in my own practice. I'm much more into formal rituals. I'm much more into composing invocations, making use of herbal materials, natural materials as well. I'm more into the ritualism insofar as it's more like a theatrical performance. I'm into more of that style, very formal material. I haven't really studied a lot about Eastern paths as much as I would like to have at this point, and I'm delving into it now. But most of my training is in Western occultism, specifically Western style, curse work or raising demons or all of this stuff. I want an encyclopedia of demonology. That's the next work, other than booklets, that I intend to purchase, because I think that'd be interesting to read. As far as sex magic goes, the basic theory depends sort of on, which side of the world you're on. In Western occultism, which has been tinged, as I've said, with Abrahamic philosophy, sex is generally seen as a negative force. It's also seen as being male dominant. That is, that the male is sort of the generative aspect. If you read the Quran, it insinuates that life comes from semen, and that the woman is essentially just sort of incubating the sperm. This is common to Abrahamic thought. The philosophy of the West being what it is, with the exception of paganism. Paganism is completely different. And I'll get into a little bit of the Bach saga. There are actually some interesting allusions to sex magic in that as well that I think people should know about. Might gross some people out, but you should know about it anyway. In Western tradition, sexual ritualism normally centers around negative, sort of aspects of the occult. That is, sort of the homunculus stuff, beat off into a clay jar with some herbal material and leave it for a week, and there'll be a homunculus and a little human will be growing inside and stuff. Yeah, I think that's from Abramelin and the Mage's work, although I may be wrong. You have all of this sort of symbolism, and the male symbol of fertility, the wand, the sword, whatever, is seen as sort of noble, powerful, potent. The female symbol is either relegated to the sidelines, or you have this sort of classic image of the witch as being the warty old crone living on the fringes of society, causing people's cows to starve and drop dead of some dread illness or something. That's essentially what sexual magic is in the West. You've got to understand that at the time that most of these materials were written, when we say old-style Western occultism, we're talking about medieval and Renaissance era literature, sometimes based on or claiming to be based on even older literature. But when we look at these things, we have to keep in mind that things like the Inquisition were going on, and these same people, these witches, so-called, one of the most common charges is they had sex out of wedlock, they had either premarital sex or adultery, or they had sex with the devil, they had sex with animals, they were kissing the goat of Mendes. They were doing something like that. And so this female sexuality, you didn't hear it about men. The dude wasn't claimed to have had sex with the devil. The woman was. And so you get this image of negative sexuality, of their sexuality being wrong, being deliberately seductive towards men, deliberately to destroy them. The idea was that woman's sexuality had to be suppressed. They actually said back then, well, women are so much more sexual than men, they're so much more seductive, and they'll lead men astray. They'll lead them away from Jesus, they'll lead them away from the church, and then these men will become lazy, incompetent, indulgent, and sexually frustrated. They'll become controlled and filled with vice. That's essentially the Western idea of female sexuality. In the Eastern path, it's different. In the Eastern paths, the female is seen as the main generative force. The vagina is seen as a penultimate sort of symbol. You have all of these very strong goddesses in these pantheons. You had it as well in the pagan world. You had it in Egypt. You had it in Samaria. You have these female... Asherah is probably the best example. Certain Jewish cults actually worshipped Asherah as the wife of Yahweh for a significant length of time. And this does not appear to have been some small lunatic fringe cult. This appears to have been a mainstream movement for several centuries, while they were, I believe, slightly after they were in Babylon. In the Eastern traditions and in some Near Eastern pagan traditions, not all but some, the female was seen as the more divine force. The female was seen as the seat of wisdom, the seat of power, the seat of life, the seat of generative and regenerative forces. And sex magic centered around, in many cases, pleasing the female in order to extract this sort of occult power for use in rituals. That is, that the ritual would literally be based around either an orgy or some sort of copulations at a specific time in a specific, lunar cycle, specific holiday for a specific purpose, things of that nature. And the female was seen as the seat of that power. And was considered actually more important than the male. The male was sort of simply, the female was there to divulge the power. The female was seen as sort of the goddess figure, a mortal female, that is. The male was essentially vestigial and mainly meant to create that regenerative force in her through sexuality. And they had the same idea. It's very strange. People generally don't understand this because they look at the Eastern cultures today. They say, well, they're just as patriarchal. What about India? You're saying that Hinduism revolves around, this female sexual energy, and yet look at all the rapes, look at them. Women are always out of work, they're always oppressed. Yes, that's because Christians took over India. Largely that's why. That's because the British occupied that area, brought Christianity in, brought patriarchal values in. Now, I'm not talking about feminism. That's a political movement. I'm simply talking about the symbolism within the occult, within sex magic itself, as far as the East is concerned. The female, not the male, was considered the main generative force. Now, there are some deities that are more... It's not exactly clear, either agendered or bigendered, that are a stand-in acceptable for men. Seth is one of them. Seth is referred to in the female tense, while being male, and is identified by name through the mother rather than the father, which is more typical of female deities. This makes Seth specifically a very important and special deity within the Egyptian pantheon, and thus Asceticism. The worship of the veneration of this pagan figure, I believe, is quite powerful. And I've got a limited amount of experience with that as well, but it seems quite powerful. On its face, it seems very historically valid, unlike most of these movements. Now, to paganism in the sense of the Norse. And I know that some Norse individuals don't want to talk about this specific aspect of Norse religion. They had what's called heart friends, and a heart friend, it's more applicable to males, although not always. It was considered important, apparently, for young males to fellate one another and absorb their sort of life fluids from one another. You actually see this in Papua New Guinea to this day, which I think is slightly hilarious. Theirs is a little bit more vulgar, I think, whereas in Norse it seems to have, primarily been people fooling around and having fun sexually with one another, whereas in New Guinea it seems like older dudes deriving pleasure from young boys, which is a little bit creepy, but they also had this apparently for females. The idea was basically pleasuring the body to derive this sort of prophetic or divinatory force from it. It seems to have been common among adults, although it's not exactly clear. And it wasn't frowned upon. It wasn't seen as sex for the same purpose as sex between a male and female. It was seen as another use for sexuality. It's like, I can't remember, Burkansi tradition, I think it was called. There are some Native American groups in the Americas, that is, that saw, for instance, things like cross-dressing as legitimate as well. And this was also considered, to them, spiritually important. Now, this isn't the case with all tribes. Some tribes didn't practice this, but in many tribes, the idea that a male could dress in female clothing, play a female role, and take a literal husband in a gay relationship it wasn't frowned upon, and it wasn't even considered homosexual. Actually, these individuals, I think it's called Berkanzi. I'll look that up and see if I can find the proper spelling and put a link in the description if I can. The idea was that they had some sort of spiritual power. Certain native groups also, this goes into the sort of mythos / legend of Johnny Appleseed. They also had a great deal of respect for people with mental illnesses. In some cases, if they were seeing things that weren't there, they were considered to be having religious visions. Apparently, this is what I've heard, and this is probably more folklore than reality. I heard that Johnny Appleseed put the pan on his head and walked around rambling primarily to keep the natives from killing him. That may be completely wrong. I mean, this may be just myth, but that's what I've heard. Somebody else can corroborate. I look stuff up about all this weird shit all day. So, you might be interested in it, maybe not. You hear about that as a little kid. Well, he planted all the apple trees. We have him to thank for all of the apples that we eat, which, of course, it's not quite the case. But, it's still an interesting story anyway. Let the kids have a cool story that they can tell their friends about on Halloween or whatever. But yeah, sex magic, it differs from culture to culture. It depends on really what culture you're looking at, because you can see one side is more important than the other, or both sides are important. The Greeks had a lot of orgies. The cult of Dionysus apparently thought it was very important to have lesbian orgies, specifically drunken lesbian orgies. I think there are a lot of dudes living nowadays who wish that they lived in ancient Greece. But it was considered important. It was considered literally. That celebrating the god of wine, women, and song, sexuality for sexuality's sake, and so forth, that it was important to do so. It kept calamity at bay. And this is how it was practiced. The idea, half of these people were never sober a day in their life. Most of the water wasn't potable, so they mixed wine with it all. And they went around half drunk, literally all day long, every goddamn day. That was part of their... But then they would get even more drunk sometimes for their celebrations. Feasting was important. The idea... Also, and I think this ties in with it, in Western Abrahamic tradition, you have asceticism. You have the idea that to be spiritual, to be holy, you have to withhold from lustful, materialistic, worldly things. You should fast, and you should give up sex outside of marriage, and you should give up this money, and you should give up this kind of belonging, and this kind of employ, and this kind of... everything you can think of. You're supposed to give a lot up in order to be spiritual. In the Eastern tradition, you also have asceticism, but at the same time, there are occult uses for these things. They're not seen as specifically bad or negative. They're seen as things you can give them up. You can vow to go without sex. You can vow to go without alcohol. You can vow to go without, whatever you want to make a vow about. But it's not seen as strictly necessary to do so. In a lot of the Eastern traditions, everyone eventually reaches that sort of enlightened highest level. It takes you a longer or shorter period. If you're willing to give a bunch of stuff up during life, you can get there a lot faster. You can be completely ascetic in your life and live as a monk, and you can meditate constantly, and in one lifetime you can ascend to that higher level. Or you can spend 100 lifetimes as a normal person living a normal life. You run the risk then of, reincarnating as someone doomed to become like an axe murderer and reincarnating as a slug. But you have that option. It's not seen as, well, you've got one fucking chance and the rest of your eternity depends on it. It's not seen that way. In the same sense, there's that difference. In terms of sexuality, in the Western tradition, it's mostly regarded as negative. Sex, in the most strict of Christian traditions, sex is not meant to be enjoyed. It's simply meant to repopulate. That's the only purpose to sexuality. Now, obviously, these people have sex, they physically enjoy it, they orgasm, they know that fact, they know that they're lying to their parishioners when they say that they don't enjoy it. They're hypocrites, they're frauds, they have no occult power or spiritual power of any kind because they're lying to people and to themselves constantly. That's what I believe. In the Eastern tradition, it's not the same way. In the Tantric tradition or whatever. There is the capability of enjoyment. It's not seen as strictly a negative thing. So as far as sex magic goes, yeah, it depends on what background you are indulging in. regardless, one side's more important than the other, or both, or neither is really more important than the other. They're just sort of there. And that's the essence of it, at large. That's about all. Just thought I'd finally talk about that. I've had a lot of people request that. I can't imagine why. I am not an expert on the subject. I have my own theories, my own philosophy, and my own rudimentary understanding of the difference between East and West on this issue, and sort of paganism and Abrahamism on the issue. But it's certainly not as in-depth as a lot of people who have studied exactly that topic for a great many years. I still want to get a copy of Nicholas and Zena's work. I think it's called something of the... I can't remember the fucking name. The one about sex magic. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank. I actually saw a copy on eBay, but it was about $300. One of the original copies, if you can believe that, because I think only about 300 were made. So it's almost impossible to get a hold of. Satanic Screen is about the only one you can find on a regular basis for some reason. The rest of them are very difficult. Flowers from Hell is the other one. But yeah, that's just a little bit about sex magic, and hopefully more occult videos to come very soon. Peace out.